For those of us who live by faith in a God we cannot see, when life is severely and painfully interrupted, the elephant in the room question is, where was God in all this? Our thoughts begin to spin out of control as we try and make sense of the damage and devastation. If God is love, how could he allow this to happen? If he's all knowing, he had to know about it. If he's all powerful, could he not have prevented it? Logically, it doesn't make sense. Several years ago, after speaking at a student event, I engaged in a conversation with a young woman who seemed distressed. It was clear that she was grappling with something significant. We were in the auditorium and there were many people around us, but she just blocked them out and somehow felt safe to share her painful story with me. Her father had lost his job and had been out of work for over a year. He picked up a few part-time jobs just to make ends meet, but the income was not even close to what their family needed. His frustration turned into depression, and when it looked like they were going to lose their home, it all became just too overwhelming for him. He lost hope, and he took his life, leaving a wife, 2 sons in high school, and this daughter who was trusting me with her broken heart. Her mind was reeling. She had just finished her freshman year of college. In the wake of this unthinkable and horrible event, she was considering just putting her dreams on hold to move home and get a job to help support her family. I tried to affirm her willingness to do whatever she needed to do, but I tried to assure her that God would lead her and her mom as they made decisions together as a family, and that he would begin to heal this deep fracture in their lives. I was not at all surprised by her response, but I was still jolted by it. Tearfully, she said, "I am so mad at God. Why did he allow this to happen? My dad loved God. And if God really loved him, why didn't he stop him from taking his life?" I could feel her pain and her anger, her disappointment in the God she thought she knew. And I knew in that moment that I could not provide answers to her questions that would fill the hole in her heart. Instead, I asked if she had told God that she was angry with him. "That's ridiculous," she said. "I could never tell God something like that." And I asked, "Well, don't you think he knows?" I explained that unlike most people, God isn't shocked by anything, and that his word tells us we can tell him anything. 1 Peter 5:7 says, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." I asked if we could just try it together. Now, by this time, most of the people had left the auditorium, and she seemed okay with the idea. We sat down in the front row, and I started our conversation with God, asking him to help my new friend and ease the pain in her heart. We sat in silence for a while, and then she slowly began to pray in broken sentences. It was all so vivid. I mean, I still remember what she prayed today. She started, "Oh God, I don't know what to do or what to think." She said, "It hurts so much. And my mom and my little brothers, I don't understand." And then she said, "Why did my dad and why didn't you stop him? Where were you? I am so angry. I'm angry at my dad." And then she said, "And I'm angry at you." And then there were no words, just tears. And she finally broke the silence and she asked God to help her with her anger and to help her trust him in this. Well, that was just the beginning. We communicated through the coming year, and there were lots of starts and stops, steps forward and steps backwards. But overall, there was steady progress as God led her to a deeper faith. She learned how to find peace in the midst of it all. And I learned that in life's interruptions, I should not impose restrictions of time or circumstances on God. Instead, I need to create space for Him to do what only He can do. When life as we prefer it and have come to expect it is interrupted, the usual question is, where is God in all this? But the best question is, who is God in all this? Debilitating questions come from seeing God as a benevolent grandfather whose purpose is to make us happy. That's a false premise. Underneath all the why questions, like why would God allow this to happen or not allow that to happen, are more profound and potentially life-changing questions. When we begin to ask, who is God in all this? And is He sovereign? We'll begin to understand His plan and purpose as we begin to discover Him. The concept of sovereignty in the political realm refers to a dominant power or supreme authority. In a monarchy, supreme power resides in the sovereign, such as a king or queen. In modern democracies, sovereign power rests with the people, and it's exercised through representative bodies such as Congress. Submission to a healthy structure of sovereignty can provide the framework for a safe and productive society. Well, in the 1970s, the ideology of sovereign citizens was hatched in a U.S. anti-government group. It grew into a movement in the 1990s. It reached Canada, later going to Australia, then the UK and Ireland. People in the sovereign citizen movement claim that they are independent from the laws of the land. In America, even though they're considered U.S. citizens, these sovereign citizens often will not pay taxes or car registrations. They won't get insurance or licenses of any kind. They feel no obligation to cooperate with the police. Hundreds of thousands of people who live as legal citizens in the United States of America identify as sovereign citizens and consider themselves separate from the U.S. government. Well, any sovereign structures that we create might have the intention to be good, but they will always be imperfect. You see, that's not the case with the sovereignty of God. His sovereignty is perfect. But sometimes it can be hard to comprehend. Pastor, author, and conference speaker Paul Tripp has a gift for making difficult things easier to understand. He defines what the Bible teaches about God's sovereignty to mean that God is in absolute control of His world and everything that happens without any gaps, limits, interference, or thwarting of His rule. Well, that word thwart is a peculiar word that suggests frustrating or standing in the way of someone by crossing or opposing. God's sovereignty means that neither He nor His plans can be frustrated, crossed, or opposed. Now, our plans may be thwarted or interrupted, but His purpose remains intact without any gaps, limits, or interference. God's sovereignty has two aspects: His decrees and His providence. God's decrees are His eternal plan. According to His own will and for His own glory, He has decided everything that will come to pass. His decrees are eternal and unchangeable. What God decrees will happen. Providence means that God doesn't just decree what will happen and then sit passively above His world. Instead, He is an active participant. He is in constant contact with the universe that He has made. He governs, sustains, affects, and controls. Paul Tripp says, He has not set the world in motion and walked away. The motion of the universe is the result of his active, sustaining, and governing control. He governs the most momentous things in the universe, all the way down to the most minor and largely unnoticed things. Sometimes we give God a low approval rating in the midst of trouble and uncertainty. We may not say it, but we're thinking, if I were God, I wouldn't allow that to happen. Like those in the sovereign citizen movement, we consider declaring ourselves sovereign. The problem is, how much can we really control? I struggle with the location of my keys, my glasses, or that cup of coffee I left somewhere in the house. If you don't possess the power to keep things under your control, it doesn't really matter if you declare yourself sovereign. But God is infinite in power and wisdom. Colossians 1:16 and 17 describes his comprehensive power and sovereignty. It says, "For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." But what if it doesn't seem like things are being held together? If God is in constant contact with the universe that he has made, if he governs, sustains, affects, and controls everything, well, why does he allow so many terrible things to happen? It's difficult to reconcile God's decrees and providence with so much pain and disappointment. And I get it. But more importantly, God gets it. He understands how hard it is for us to trust and be faithful when everything seems out of control. We know he understands because he physically inserted himself in the world he created. Hebrews 4:15 is talking about Jesus when it says this, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin." You see, Jesus was fully God and fully man. One of the best displays of his deity and humanity is in the story of Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha. The sisters sent word to Jesus that his friend Lazarus was sick, but Jesus didn't drop what he was doing and run to his aid. When he finally arrived, well, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Each of the sisters said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." You can just feel their disappointment. They wanted to know, where was God in all this? It's a question about his sovereignty. And on some level, I think there are times when all of us have wondered the same thing. Jesus felt their pain and disappointment, and he feels ours today. Mary and Martha believed the absence of Jesus was the cause of their brother's death and were convinced that his presence would have kept him alive. It seemed logical, but in this case, whether Jesus had been there or not, Lazarus still would have died because God's sovereignty and his divine plan involved a much bigger purpose. Jesus said something to Martha that's foundational to our faith. He said, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." And then he asked, "Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world." The life that comes through believing in Jesus is not interrupted by physical death. We need to answer the same question Jesus asked Martha. Do we believe that Jesus is the resurrection and the life? On their way to the tomb where Lazarus was buried, Scripture tells us that Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. It says Jesus wept. There were some in the crowd who saw his tears as evidence of how much he loved Lazarus, but others were cynical, and they said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Well, Jesus was setting the stage for an incredible miracle that would display God's power and sovereignty. At the tomb of Lazarus, he told them to take away the stone, and then he prayed, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Now, notice his prayer wasn't a petition. He wasn't asking God to do anything. He was thanking him and praying for the sake of the crowd that the incredible miracle they were about to witness would help them believe, like Martha, that he was truly the resurrection and the life. And then Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Throughout this story, Jesus directed the attention to a bigger picture. All of his miracles were displays of God's power and glory. It was never just about the miracle or the healing. I have a friend whose son suffered from PTSD after serving on the battlefield. He was getting help, but it seemed like he'd take one step forward and two steps back. It finally became too overwhelming for him, and he took his life. I remember my own shock and disbelief when I arrived at the scene that night to be with my friend. For a long time, this dad was lost in the thought of, where was God in all this? If he had been here, my son wouldn't have died. He questioned the love of God and even the existence of God for over a year, until he finally began to emerge with a deeper sense of faith and purpose. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9 offers this perspective. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Well, that truth is comforting for some, but it can be irritating to others. The goal is not to modify our behavior and put on a happy face. God doesn't want us to just grin and bear it. Behavior modification is frustrating. We need transformation. And only God can change our hearts and elevate the way we think. Here are some closing words from Paul Tripp about the benefits of a functional belief in God's sovereignty, which will help us create space for God to reveal more of himself and do what only he can do. Functional belief in the doctrine of the sovereignty of God will result in personal humility and a more profound, more genuine spirit of thanksgiving and worship. But it will also produce a confidence in your soul that cannot be shaken. Your Lord never has questions, never is surprised, never is frustrated, never wonders, never is greeted with mystery, never wishes he could have, never looks back with regret, never is hoping, never is waiting, never feels helpless, has nothing he can't figure out, and never finds himself at a loss. No one can back God into a corner. He is never pressed to do something. There is no authority over him that he has to answer to. In a world that appears so out of control, your confidence will never be found in figuring your life out, but in trusting the one who has it all figured out for his glory and your eternal good.